Welcome back to the Mom Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and co-host is Chris Lucian. And today is basically going to be Chris and I having a discussion and sharing on what does it mean to be a learning organization? We both just read this book called The Fifth Discipline. We've also read some other books related to that, being a learning organization, learning team, all those kind of things. And also it's something we've been striving to do where we work for a long time, so I guess maybe to kick it off, maybe we'll talk about what it's not a little bit. So Chris, is, being a learning organization is basically just all we need to do is just schedule more training and just jam more information down.
Find every possible certification and like every peripheral thing that you may or may not need.
Yes.
Exactly. Definitely not. I think that it's kind of funny because I think in a lot of organizations, like learning is something that managers and other leaders, feel like they need to have their teams do, but they don't. It needs to be, structured and maybe directed towards, maybe they pay for a conference for their team for the tools that they use, and then it's like, oh, I'm done, they've learned new things and now we're going to go into the next year armed with everything we need to know going forward, or something in those lines. So yeah, I don't know, how about you? What was
Yeah, and I think I just got finished reading Turn the Ship Around, thanks to your recommendation, and then I read this one. And so I feel like there's a cool tie-in, right? And so in Turn the Ship Around, he talks about, he wants to give the power to the people doing the work, right? And so instead of, information going up the chain to authority, it's giving authority to the people with information. And one of the problems with that was that it's basically chaotic unless the people doing the work have enough information to actually make decisions, like whether it's technical information or domain information. And so if it is a better model that, the intelligence is with the people doing the work, as opposed to just someone sitting up on high, just handing out tasks to everybody who knows how to do everything, then being a learning organization is key. And so one of the things I remember from Turn the Ship Around for them was it wouldn't really make sense until everything that was happening was a learning moment, right? As opposed to being, oh, I go to work today and I just do what I'm told and I don't have to think a whole lot, is that I have to be learning from my context all the time for me to be competent enough to be a good decision maker in the system, right?
Yeah, and I think that's also important. So in the Fifth Discipline, there's a lot of discussion around this idea that if you feel like you're just a part of you're just part of the whole system and you're doing your job, and if something goes wrong, then it must be somebody's fault, because if everybody's doing their job, then everything should just flow properly. And often the entire system is not taken into account. And I think that that's a great parallel, because Turn the Ship Around also, I think that in the very beginning of the book, they talk about how everything was operating before, totally command and control, and morale was down because people didn't have the ability to affect the system as a whole, and everybody was coming in to just kind of do their job. So there's probably a key element there of having the ability, I guess the agency to modify the system as a whole, and that I think also then implies that you're doing some level of systems thinking, and paying attention to feedback loops and the building of momentum, or the destruction of momentum in any given feedback loop. And so I found all of those things really interesting. I think that so when someone is learning in a learning organization, or when the organization as a whole is learning, it's paying attention to the system, paying attention to the things that will lead to kind of a compounding of ability, and and I think that like that's kind of the tie into mobbing even is like, you have one person's perspective in the system, and maybe the entire system is a little harder to see. But now you have, a cross-disciplinary view of what the system could be, and with different perspectives. And so, maybe the system is not perfectly clear, but it can be analyzed, taking much more into account given the number of people involved.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And I think that was a huge like win for me from like some of these books and then day-to-day life working in a system, right? Is that I like how in Turn the Ship Around, I was talking about the untapped potential, human potential that was just living in the team or the organizations where they were a part of the system, seeing problems, but basically not acting, right? Or not helping to solve those problems. Like an order would be given, they know it's not going to work, but they just do it anyways because it's, well, I'm just doing my job, And then I think the example given in the fifth discipline was like it was like the game they play with the ordering beer between like the retailer and the supplier and the creator of it, right? Where those people didn't feel like that what they were observing meant anything enough to like discuss it in the overall system. And so from what I can see in kind of like a learning organization is you need to have that collective dialogue and collective vision making, right? And so like a collective vision and then also a collective experience of reality, right? So if I'm just alone and just blaming, it's easy to blame because I don't understand, I don't have that empathy. And it's also easier just to work hard, right? Like, so from like a technical perspective, it's like, I think one you brought up before was, well, there's errors in the data every day, so I'm just going to keep manually fixing them, right? And I can just, work harder to manually fix them. Where an awareness where you have a dialogue with others in the system, you really become aware of like, oh, well, the data, what's causing this error in the data, and what can we do to prevent it or stop it or fix it faster? And I really like that once like people clue in to this, not only the ability to do something about it, but the ability to learn about the system, is that once you have the vision of what it could be and what it is, it's almost natural for everyone just to start working and dogpiling to fix it, Yeah. And it just initiative naturally kicks in. But I think the thing is it won't work unless people feel like they have responsibility and initiative, right? Because if I don't care, it's just like, well, whatever.
Yeah, so it could be easily related to Kaizen and lean manufacturing and that as well, right? So noticing a improvement that can improve the entire system. I think even those are a little bit localized compared to the kind of systems thinking approach of inflows, outflows, and feedback loops. But I think that all of those sorts of things are kind of in the spirit of the learning organization, right? It's like the organization as a whole is going to adapt to changing circumstances. And I think that often I just see organizations that are very comfortable with the status quo and in particular don't take those Kaizen opportunities. They don't fight, they stagnate a little bit over time. And I think that it's a lot about will the company, will the team, will the individual identify something and learn more, or will they stick with the status quo? And I see this a lot with repetitive code being written. I think a learning organization would identify something repetitive and either turn it into a template or develop a new abstraction or create a code generator. and every time that you do something 2 or 3 times, especially maybe in code or other things, new refactoring tools come along, all those sorts of things. Every time you repeat yourself, I think to me it's like we've repeated ourselves just now. Like, what can we learn from that? How can we learn to do the work better? How can we sharpen the saw, so to speak? Those sorts of things.
Right on, right on. And I think maybe something that didn't occur in my mind until just now, and even for our own kind of like mob programming philosophy culture stuff, is when I always thought of, hey, let's create a learning culture. The first thing that came to mind to me was conferences, learning time, and things like that. And while those things are good, and they really help lots of things, they help create a lot of virtuous loops in the system. I think what I'm starting to learn is that even more significant and more primary than that is that you are learning all the time, right?
Yeah.
Every time you're doing work, you are learning about the system, right? Or at least turn it into that kind of event, right? Because then that's how, as opposed to it being like, and it also makes it way more practical too, right? Because not every company, not every organization can afford, maybe they should, but maybe for whatever reason, constraints, can afford to send everyone to these trainings or, take away time from other things to do it. But if everything you're doing is a learning event, then that competence can build up everywhere in the organization and it's no longer siloed, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think what things have you seen that help switch people from that mode of like learning is separate from work and then work is yeah.
So I think a big piece of it is like a process of experimentation, right? So I think you can really tell this I think pretty quickly from observing a retrospective, right? So I think retrospectives are kind of a formalized way to help move a learning organization or move a group of people toward being a learning organization, for example. And so if you see retrospectives that don't end up in an experiment, either there are no action items that you come out with, or you have way too many action items and there's no follow-up. Unless your retrospectives end up being kind of like a hypothesis, a duration, an anecdotal style experiment, and then maybe developing some axioms at the end, then you're not really trying to, you're not learning from the experience, right? Because if you create a lot of action items and things are better, but you don't really know why, then you haven't developed any knowledge to internalize. And then I think the other way of doing that, the opposite end of that is just doing them as a rote practice, in order to say, yes, we're agile because we do retrospectives. And so, but I think that, that essence that of experimentation to identify new effects on the system has to be fairly continuous. And even, it's like, oh yes, our team needs unit testing because they say unit testing is good, right? I think that you might direct your learning toward that, and it may eventually end up being incorporated into your process, but kind of observing and understanding the impacts of unit testing on your overall system, especially with delays in the system, right? So, in the complex adaptive systems kind of terminology, you have these delayed inflows, and so you might do something, but you might not see your improvements come until 6 months later. And I think that in the fifth discipline, for example, they make a point to say, often we might take like a Tylenol to get rid of a headache or something, and we know not to take more just because we didn't feel that the effect of the headache went away. But with the example of the beer game in the book, the exact same sort of thing. There was a delay in the whole system that then ended up causing everybody to behave weird. And so, unless it's like really written for us on the bottle, right, that delayed reinforcing loop doesn't become evident. And so, really identifying, not only the instant feedback loops, but those much longer feedback loops in the system. Those are some of the areas where it's like, hey, we start unit testing now. 6 months later, our bugs go down, but maybe 3 months in, somebody just says, well, this isn't really helping us. Our bug rate is the same, and we're spending twice as long working on tests. And so I think that some of those were some of the really key insights for me.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and I like how you tied that kind of the systems thinking part, because there's this part of the fifth discipline where he's stating something that was going on with Toyota, and someone was saying like, oh yeah, you have Kanban, you have quality circles, you do all the same stuff, but you're not getting the same results. Like what's the difference here? And it's like, well, you're not seeing how all the parts work together. You're not working towards like a collective common vision. You're just copying pasting practices, right? And so yeah, and so tying that into what you were saying, where to see, I think you're right that the systems thinking part needs to be modeled, and that's maybe where mobbing comes in, right? Is because you can have someone in the mob be like, hey, why are we keep doing this repetitive thing, or we keep having this problem again? Maybe it'd be good to go talk to this other part of the system and solve the deeper thing. And so when you're modeling it in a mob or a team, like, hey, let's go think deeper about the system. Let's go talk to other parts of the system, and let's figure out how we impact each other. I love what you said about the fast feedback, because I think when a system gets more and more complex, and it gets, whether it's designed to be that way or it just happened to be that way, when the feedback loops are really slow, it causes so much confusion. People don't understand how they're, like, when we deliver this feature, when we work on this part of the database, why it breaks something, 20 steps away. And so I love one thing that I've seen that's strongly correlated with mobbing is all the things that matter are automated such that the feedback is instantaneous, right? So if there's potential to break something like in another part of the system, whether it's the human system or a technical system, there is something automated that will break and fail in a pipeline or send an email or, and so that feedback is instantaneous, because then the mystery goes away, right? And that's part of some of my disillusionment with things in pipelines that make them go slow, so end-to-end tests or things like that, that if they're written a particular way or used a particular way, the thing that caused breakage in a system or pain or people being upset or bad results, a bad product, and is so delayed from the discovery of it that people in the system don't know what they're doing to cause the problem, right? And so I just love seeing how a mob will come together, see two parts of a system that are separated in time or space or whatever, and then make them make it obvious to everyone that whenever something breaks here, this is why,
Yeah, and I think that was really evident in the beer game, because they had really slow feedback loops, and they made a point to point out that like maybe 5% of the people that play the game end up actually doing well, and those are the ones that actually kind of stop and have everybody start talking to each other and identifying where all the issues were. And what's interesting about it is that, basically we can react to something going wrong, and it will then make things even worse and even worse and even worse. And so you have kind of this, like, you might have a lot of momentum in what you're doing, but if you lose sight of the entire system and the relative feedback loops, then you can grind everything to a halt. And a lot of that, I think those sorts of things end up being a really important aspect of learning organizations in general. And so not only are you doing, directed learning and training to affect those, but a lot of the times also I'll see like, okay, a team that's never been exposed to unit testing before, they're going to do some training in unit testing, and it might be completely outside of their environment, but then maybe like one day, one of those people ends up saying, hey, I remember that from that training, this would be really useful now, and maybe they just do a few at that point. And so the effect of that training also, it has its own delayed feedback loop, right? And so just being hyper aware of all of these things that are shared over time, and then learning from those things and analyzing them, and I think that's a big difference. And also, I think companies in general are pretty good at this idea of like sharpening the saw, and I think that's probably like the first step, right? Is like to just say, hey, these are the skills that we use every day. Let's practice them actively. And then gradually you kind of level up from there, so to speak. You find, identifying the feedback loops, finding out how to tweak them here and there, just to see the response of the entire system. Often we're not able to see or control the entire system, right? So a lot of our businesses are B2B, or you might have a B2C sort of model, but I think that's probably the simplest style, right? And so a lot of these companies have distributors, and those distributors have the people that buy from them, but that might not be the end customer. And so often I think there are a lot of opportunities for things that happen in the beer game to exist in our businesses. And one thing I really liked about the book, actually, they talked about, when coordinating a business to business interaction, stopping with a kind of life or death negotiation style discussion, and just talk about like what would the conversation look like if you were both in the same company, just trying to make it work internally to your own company, ignoring negotiations and prices and everything like that. And they kind of go on to say that often the optimal solution ends up being in there, even with all of this added layers of being part of separate companies and stuff like that. So they had a really good point in kind of what a learning organization looks like with B2B transactions, which I thought was also kind of, it's a little bit outside of the scope of the software development, but I think, especially in situations where maybe you're working with a third-party API vendor, that's a great example of, if you were part of the same company and working to just make this thing work and work effectively, what would you do? And not letting the financials color the experience, I think was a really interesting call out that they made in the book.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think it kind of digs into anti-patterns that I had some thoughts on and questions on, and I think you're right. And whether it's different companies, I've seen that happen as well, where an interaction between a third-party vendor dramatically improves as soon as we're like, hey, let's just talk to them, let's just mob with them, let's just call them, let's just interact with them as if they're another team member. And then that flow of information and feedback just starts happening. And so I could see that, but I could also see it internally, right? Like, it's tempting that when you're on a team to see another department or another team that you interact with as like a separate entity, and to naturally put up walls and maybe not care about their outputs as much as yours and that kind of thing. And really, you're just sub-optimizing the system, right? You're not really helping yourself. You're not really helping them in the long run. And so, yeah, what are things you have seen that are kind of detrimental to, because I think, so one thing I've seen in a lot of these, in my own experience, in a lot of these books on the learning organization, is that dialogue is key, right? You have different parts of the system and you got to come together and have dialogue and a collective understanding of two things. One, the vision where we need to go, and then 2, where we currently are, which is probably not at the vision yet, right? We haven't reached there yet. But it doesn't always work out. Just starting to talk to the other parts of the system doesn't just magically fix things, So
Yeah.
have you seen things go wrong? And
absolutely,
yeah.
I think one of the key ones is like the throwing it over the fence sort of thing. And just in general, longer timelines for feedback loops and things. But like, what's interesting is the perpetual suboptimal decision making that can happen when you kind of just divide a team, based on maybe discipline, rather than the product that they're working on or something along those lines. Like, oh, hey, this thing is done now, I'm just going to throw it over the fence. And I think in our industry, the key separation is like testing being separated from development, right? And so you could start with TDD, and you could TDD the tests that will be done afterward, and then you could as developers and testers together go and do that work together, right? Like mob the whole thing with the testers, right? And often then we'll start catching the failures first. But I think just in general, with a separate testing team, this may not happen, but I think often it does, is throw it over the fence, wait for them to wait for the others to then get back to you, and then act on those things. And I think the classic example of the ping pong bug is like a great example of delayed feedback loops, not learning from delayed feedback loops. Because I've seen this happen early in my career, where it's like developer A works on a feature and deploys it to production. Then developer B modifies a dependency to developer A's feature. And then a bug is assigned to developer A because his feature is broken. And then developer A then finds what went wrong and fixes the problem. And then developer B has a bug assigned to them because their feature is broken, but developer A's feature is fixed. And so developer B goes in, and these things are happening maybe 3 months apart, because you have like a whole release cycle, and then it goes out to the users, and then the users finally notice it and then send it back. And so developer B fixes their bug, and then now developer A's bug is there. And only if developer A notices or remembers that maybe 3 to 6 months ago they fixed that bug, would they have an opportunity to identify that cycle happened. But I've even seen situations where that it's gone back multiple times, back and forth between them, and that's like a big thing. Like unit tests are really interesting, because a lot of people will be like, oh, I write unit tests for myself, or I write them on a team or whatever. But unit tests I view as like a temporal communication technique. So you're even giving yourself an indication of what you intended months or years from now, as well as giving other developers that intention if they didn't work with you on it. And so I just like the time-based effects that unit tests have across a project.
And it's fast, right? So
yeah.
As soon as you make a change, the message is sent to the developer who did it, right?
Yeah.
The team who did it. Hey, here's this message for you when you made that change,
Yeah. And because the opposite, the anti-pattern, is just letting these really long feedback loops play out, and you don't realize how much effectiveness or efficiency you've lost over a long period of time. And it gets hidden, and no one notices, and people just kind of keep going about their day. And maybe that gets chalked up to their bug rate. And that's also a negative impact. Like, say that their performance reviews are based off of how many bugs they get, and they're just tossing this bug back and forth, right? So they're destroying their own metrics, and they don't even know, right? And so that's why a big that's why thinking about these long-term feedback loops are really important.
Yeah. And it, what's really cool about all this, and I think there's a big tie-in to, I mean, we've been saying it kind of in pieces all along, is systems thinking, learning organization, and mob programming, I think have a really strong synergy for several reasons, right? Because some of the anti-patterns you talk about, right, is just like, oh, we'll just start talking to people. Well, if people don't know how to talk to other disciplines and parts of the systems well, it may not lead to anything, right? So like you were saying before, if people just start talking, but they have no ability to experiment, or they have no power to change the system. I remember in a previous organization and team, we would have these retrospectives and people were checked out because they just knew we had no power to make a difference on these problems, right? And so if you get different parts of the system talking, but they don't have power to do anything or run experiments, then it's just talk. It doesn't really help anything, right? Another anti-pattern is if you go into a quote unquote dialogue just to advocate, right? I'm all for advocation. I love hearing other people's opinion. I want to advocate, but if you're not there to learn from the other part of the system what's going on, you don't really have an objective understanding of the reality of the system, because all you have is, oh, I came to tell this other part of the system how it is. It's kind of like, you're not really going to learn. You're not really a learning organization unless you're really learning about those other parts of the system. And I think the big synergy for mobbing comes in is because if maybe a side effect for mob programming is I've seen is that people who have been mob programming well for a while, they get really good at the opposite of these anti-patterns. They get really good at inquiry, about learning from others, about being on a team and making decisions, right? So at least in the mobs we work in, they have extreme ownership. They have the ability to do things and change, and they own their outcomes, right? And so basically all of us, every human has lots of dialogue issues, and it has all these inner anti-patterns built into us. But if you're mob programming, it's really hard, and you figure out how to do it well with the team. It's really hard to have an absence of trust. It's really hard to have a fear of conflict anymore. It's really hard to have a lack of commitment and accountability, because the only way you can keep mobbing well is to establish trust, is to have good conflict and figure out how to commit with the team. And so I think I've seen people who've been mob programming well for a while tend to be really good systems thinkers. You just throw them in a system and they'll naturally start learning how the system works, and learning from inquiring about the different parts of the system, and sharing information and increasing feedback loops and those kind of things. And so I don't think it's not, the inverse isn't true. Like, to be a good system thinker, you must first be a good mob programmer. But I think a good mob programmer tends to turn out to be a good systems thinker. I don't know. What's your experience there?
Yeah, I think as long as, you kind of said it there, where it's asking questions and clarifying, right? And so I think often in mobs, I will see, even if one person doesn't really have a full picture of the system, there is space and opportunity to ask about the whole system and clarify. And so, I think that, there's situations where, and different practices where if you're in a situation where it's really not good, then you might have everybody with a different idea of where you are and where you're going. And I've seen practices emerge like everyone draws and other things like that. And this idea that maybe everybody draws the architecture as they understand it now, and then talks about the differences and things like that. So one key thing that I think comes out of that is that, everybody's mental model gets put on the table, and then, everybody has some parts right and some parts wrong. And as soon as you reconcile all of them together, like, everybody's understanding is the better for it. And constructive dialogue and can come out of it. And so those events often are just not available to people in their careers. Maybe they're a solo developer who has one way of thinking about it and only learns from their mistakes kind of late in the development. And maybe they're just being told kind of what to do and how to do it. Even I think especially in systems where architecture is defined by a separate architect, right? Because then it's like, okay, I'm a developer. I've been handed down this direction to go in. I have no idea why this choice was made, and I'm going to just execute on it. That inherently, I think, just reduces learning, right? Like you're as an organization, that system in particular is going out of its way to reduce the amount of learning happening. And so then, that individual gets a limited view of the system, can only execute on their portion of the system. And I think, mobbing just kind of naturally inverts that, which is really cool.
Nice. Well, cool. Well, we might be coming up on time, and maybe we'll, we've kind of explored abstractly a lot. Maybe we'll bring it down back to planet Earth to end. If someone were looking to become, take a step towards systems thinking or a learning organization, what's an experiment you might throw at them to try out?
Yeah. Well, so I did, if you haven't read The Fifth Discipline, it's been recommended to me multiple times, and we read it recently and got a lot out of it. I do think that doing a systems thinking style map of whatever system you are in, and acknowledging the long-term feedback loops in your system, and thinking about those things could be really helpful. And then also getting, many people involved in that, and then deciding, what do you learn? How do you improve? How do you sharpen the saw around those feedback loops, and understanding and experimenting, those sorts of things. So for me, that's it. How about you, Austin? You got any?
No, I like that a lot. And I think just learning about it is a good one. I think for me, one that is maybe too practical, so it probably runs the risk of being inapplicable in some contexts, but is just next time you encounter a problem, so kind of going back to the fifth discipline in the book, the example of the beer game where had all these different parties ordering, and they're getting angry at each other because people were ordering more, but there wasn't more. And then they ordered more on top of that. And then they got too much, so is that the next time you're in a situation where you're like, this isn't good. I'm feeling pain for, in my part of the system, I'm feeling pain and I'm tempted to just try harder, is to instead step back, look at the bigger picture, and then just say I don't need to understand the entire system. Maybe that's too much, but maybe go one or two nodes out and then just bring them into your team, bring them into a discussion, bring them into a mob session or whatever, and then just ask questions to learn about the system. Because I think it'll naturally generate empathy, and you'll learn more about the system. And I think what I've usually seen is naturally you find ways to solve the problem that's not try harder or they're messing up over there in that part of the system. It's just usually really good things just to come out of that. It's just, I'm experiencing pain. Let me talk to other parts of the system that are involved and learn from them. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
Well,
cool.
For our audience out there, if you know somebody that maybe is affected by slower feedback loops and maybe are frustrated, maybe you can recommend this episode to them. And then also be sure to like and subscribe and all that. And we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.